Imagine being told to get on your knees, in your own country, by someone who has no idea who you are. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across Maple Avenue, the kind of quiet suburban street where nothing ever seemed to happen, until it did, and right now every eye was locked on the scene unfolding beside a parked black sedan, where Officer Daniel Brooks stood rigid, one hand gripping his service weapon, his voice sharp, cutting through the still air. I said, "Get down now." But the woman in front of him didn't move, not an inch, not a tremble, not even a shift in her breathing. Naomi Carter stood there in a simple navy coat and worn leather shoes, her posture straight, her chin level, her eyes steady in a way that didn't match the tension building around her, as if the moment itself refused to bend her. And that's what unsettled him most, because this wasn't how it usually went. People complied, people panicked, people explained themselves, but she did none of that. She just stood there, calm, controlled, like the chaos around her hadn't reached her yet, and the silence stretched, heavy, uncomfortable, broken only by the faint hum of passing cars slowing down, drivers turning their heads, phones already lifting, capturing, judging, whispering. What did she do? Someone muttered from the sidewalk, but Naomi didn't answer. She didn't plead. She didn't argue. She simply looked at him, and in that look was something deeper than defiance, something that didn't need to shout to be heard. And Daniel felt it. Even if he didn't understand it, his jaw tightening, his grip adjusting, trying to reclaim control over a moment that felt like it was slipping. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he added, louder now, for the crowd, for himself, for the version of authority he had always relied on. But still, she didn't move. And that's when the first crack appeared, not in her, but in him, because authority only works when it's believed. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure it was, a breeze rolled through, lifting a strand of her hair, revealing a faint scar near her temple, old, healed, the kind of mark that carried a story no one here could see. And as the seconds ticked by, something shifted in the air. Subtle, almost invisible, like the moment itself was holding its breath, waiting, because this wasn't just another stop. This wasn't just another command. And somewhere in the distance, the low rumble of an approaching engine began to grow, unnoticed by most, but not by her, her eyes flickering for just a fraction of a second before returning to him, steady as ever. And in that instant, everything that was about to change had already begun. The sound of that approaching engine grew louder, deeper, not like the casual traffic that passed through Maple Avenue, but something heavier, deliberate. And Naomi Carter heard it before anyone else did, not because it was obvious, but because she had spent years training herself to notice what others ignored, the shift in rhythm, the subtle change in air, the way moments like this never stayed still for long. And still she did not move, her hands relaxed at her sides, her shoulders squared, her breathing even, while Officer Daniel Brooks felt the weight of the moment pressing harder against him, the silence stretching in ways he could not control. And that silence began to work against him, because the crowd was no longer just watching, they were questioning. Phones raised higher now, whispers sharper. "Why is she not reacting?" someone asked, and that question lingered, because it did not fit the pattern, it did not match the story people expected to see. And Daniel felt it slipping, that invisible grip he had always relied on, the certainty that his voice alone could command the outcome. "Last warning," he said. But it sounded different this time, thinner, like it had to push through something unseen. And Naomi's gaze did not break, not even for a second. She simply looked at him as if she had already measured the situation and found nothing in it that could shake her. And that was when he noticed it, not the scar this time, but the way she carried herself, the stillness, the discipline, the kind of presence that did not belong to someone caught off guard. It belonged to someone who had stood in far more demanding moments and walked through them without hesitation. And that realization flickered through him, quick and unwelcome, because it did not align with the version of her he had already decided in his mind. And before he could push that thought away, the low rumble turned into a sharp arrival as a black government SUV rolled into view and stopped with precision just a few yards away, its engine idling with quiet authority. And everything shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that the energy in the street changed direction. Conversation stopped, heads turned, and even Daniel's focus broke for a fraction of a second as the driver's door opened and a man in a crisp uniform stepped out, his posture immediate, his expression controlled, and he did not rush. He did not shout. He simply walked forward with purpose, eyes scanning once, landing on Naomi. And in that instant something unspoken passed between them, something that did not need explanation, and Daniel felt it before he understood it. That subtle shift where the ground beneath a moment begins to tilt, where certainty turns into doubt, and doubt begins to spread. And as the man approached, his voice calm but firm cut through the tension. "Ma'am," he said. Not to Daniel, not to the crowd, but to her. And that single word landed heavier than anything that had been said so far, because it carried recognition, it carried respect, and it carried a weight Daniel could not place yet. But he felt it, and for the first time since this began, he hesitated, just slightly, just enough for the moment to start changing sides. The word lingered in the air. "Ma'am." And it changed everything. Not loudly, not instantly, but in a way that spread through the crowd, like a ripple across still water, because respect had entered a moment that had been built on assumption. And Naomi Carter did not turn right away. She let the silence hold for one more second, just long enough for the weight of that word to settle. And when she finally shifted her gaze, it was not rushed, not reactive. It was controlled, deliberate, like every movement had purpose. And the man in uniform stopped a few feet from her, his posture straightening even further, his eyes no longer scanning but fixed, certain. And then he spoke again, quieter this time, but somehow carrying more authority than anything that had been said before. "General Carter." And the name landed like a sudden drop in altitude, sharp, undeniable, and Officer Daniel Brooks felt it before he could process it, felt the ground of the situation tilt beneath him as the pieces he had ignored began to rearrange themselves too quickly to stop. "General," the word echoed in his mind, not fitting, not matching the image he had already locked in place. And yet everything around him began to confirm it. The uniformed man's stance, the way he addressed her, the sudden stillness of the crowd as whispers turned into silence. Because people understood titles even when they did not understand the full story, and Naomi finally turned her head slightly toward the man, acknowledging him with the smallest nod, not as a stranger, but as someone accustomed to being recognized. And in that simple motion there was no surprise, no relief, only confirmation, as if this moment had already been anticipated long before it arrived. And Daniel's grip shifted again, not tighter, not stronger, but uncertain, because certainty requires clarity, and clarity was slipping fast. "General," the man repeated, now louder, making sure there was no misunderstanding. And the word carried across the street, reaching every phone, every ear, every assumption that had been made just moments ago. And the crowd reacted not with noise, but with a sudden, collective awareness, the kind that makes people straighten, the kind that makes them realize they have been watching something they did not fully understand. And Daniel's voice, when it came, was no longer sharp, no longer commanding. It was searching. "General," he echoed, as if saying it might make sense, but it did not, because the situation had already moved beyond him. And Naomi's eyes returned to him, steady as ever, but now there was something else behind them, not anger, not triumph, but a quiet authority that had been there all along, waiting. And when she spoke, her voice was calm, even, measured in a way that did not need to rise to be heard. "Officer," she said, and that single word carried a weight he had not felt before, not because of how it was said, but because of who was saying it. And in that moment, the roles began to reverse, not with force, not with confrontation, but with truth. And the truth did not need to shout. It only needed to stand still long enough to be seen. The shift was undeniable now, not loud, not chaotic, but precise, like a line had been quietly redrawn, and everyone could feel it, even if they could not explain it. And Officer Daniel Brooks stood there caught in the space between what he thought this moment was and what it had just become, his shoulders still squared but no longer certain, his voice caught somewhere behind the realization forming too fast to control, because authority had changed hands without a single raised tone. And Naomi Carter remained exactly where she had been from the start, calm, grounded, unmoved, but now the stillness around her carried recognition instead of doubt. And the uniformed man beside her took one step back, not out of hesitation but out of respect, giving her space the way someone does when they understand they are standing next to a presence that outranks the moment itself. And the crowd, once filled with whispers and quiet judgment, had fallen into a different kind of silence. The kind that comes when people realize they have witnessed something they were not prepared to understand. Phone still raised, but now steady, focused, recording not conflict but consequence. And Daniel swallowed. The motion small but visible, his mind racing through every second that had led him here, every assumption, every decision, every word spoken with certainty that now felt misplaced. And for the first time he looked at her not as a problem to control, but as a reality he had failed to see. "I did not know," he said finally, the words coming out slower than he intended, not defensive, not firm, just uncertain. And Naomi's expression did not change, not because she had not heard him, but because she had heard it before, in different forms, in different places, from people who had reached the same point too late. And when she responded, her voice carried no anger, no edge, only clarity. "That is the problem," she said, each word measured, not to confront him but to define the moment. And the sentence lingered, heavier than any accusation could have been, because it was not about him alone. It was about something larger, something that extended beyond this street, beyond this moment, into patterns that repeated until someone refused to move. And Daniel felt it, not as a direct blow, but as a weight settling on his understanding. The realization that this had never been about control, it had been about perception, and perception had just been proven wrong in front of everyone. And somewhere behind him, another patrol car slowed, then stopped, officers stepping out, their movements cautious, their expressions shifting as they took in the scene. The uniform, the posture, the quiet authority radiating from Naomi, and without needing instruction, without needing explanation, they adjusted, their stance changing from response to acknowledgement. And Daniel noticed it, how quickly the environment aligned itself with the truth once it was visible, how fast the structure he relied on could correct itself when confronted with something undeniable. And that realization settled deeper than anything else, because it meant this moment could have been different from the start. And Naomi's gaze remained steady on him for one final second before she shifted slightly, not stepping back, not stepping forward, just enough to signal that the moment had already moved beyond confrontation. And in that quiet movement, the message was clear. This was no longer his situation to control. It was his to answer, for the street no longer belonged to confusion. It belonged to clarity, and clarity has a way of exposing everything that tried to hide inside assumption. And Officer Daniel Brooks felt that exposure settling in, not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, undeniable realization that every choice he had made in the last few minutes was now being seen from a different angle, not just by the people around him, but by himself. And that was the part he could not escape, because the moment had stopped being about what he thought he saw and had become about what was actually true. And truth does not adjust itself to protect pride. It stands still and lets everything else shift around it. And Naomi Carter remained exactly where she had always been, composed, steady, her presence now fully recognized, no longer questioned, and the officers who had just arrived positioned themselves with quiet precision, not rushing in, not escalating, but aligning with what was already clear, their posture respectful, their tone measured, because the situation had moved beyond uncertainty into something defined. And one of them stepped forward, glancing briefly at Daniel before addressing Naomi. "Ma'am, are you all right?" And the question itself carried a weight that said everything about how the moment had changed. And Naomi gave a small nod, not dramatic, not drawn out, just enough to acknowledge that she was. Her voice calm when she spoke. "I am fine." And that was all she needed to say, because she was not here to prove strength. She was strength. And Daniel stood there, the distance between him and everyone else now feeling wider than the few feet that separated them, because authority had shifted in a way he could not reverse. And he lowered his arm slowly, not out of instruction, not because someone told him to, but because the moment itself demanded it, because holding on to it any longer would only make the truth more visible. And as he did, the subtle sound of movement behind him confirmed what he already felt, the system adjusting. Officers stepping closer, not aggressively, not forcefully, but with a quiet finality that said this was no longer his lead. And Daniel's breath felt heavier, his thoughts louder, because now there was nothing left to act on, only something to answer for. And Naomi watched him for a moment, not with judgment, not with satisfaction, but with a kind of calm that came from understanding. Something deeper than this single interaction, and when she spoke again, her voice carried that same measured clarity. "What you see first is not always the truth," she said, and the words settled into the space between them, not as a lesson meant to embarrass, but as a reality that had just unfolded in front of everyone, and the crowd, once distant observers, now felt like witnesses to something more than a confrontation. They were watching a correction, a realignment of what should have been clear from the beginning, and Daniel's eyes dropped for a brief second before lifting again, not with the same certainty, not with the same authority, but with something closer to understanding, because the moment had stripped away everything else, leaving only the truth behind, and the truth had not needed to raise its voice to be heard. The air settled into a strange kind of stillness, not empty but full, like every second now carried weight that could not be ignored, and Officer Daniel Brooks felt it pressing in from all sides, not from the crowd, not from the officers around him, but from the realization that the moment had already moved beyond anything he could fix with a command or a tone. And that was the part that lingered, because there was no instruction left to give, only consequences unfolding in quiet, deliberate steps. And the senior officer who had arrived with the black SUV stepped forward, his presence calm but unmistakably firm, his eyes briefly meeting Daniel's before shifting away, not in anger, not in confrontation, but in acknowledgement of a situation that had already defined itself, and his voice came steady, measured. Officer Brooks stepped back, and there was no resistance in it, no raised volume, just a certainty that did not invite argument, and Daniel complied, not because he was forced to, but because something inside him recognized that this was no longer his place to stand. And as he took that step, it felt heavier than it should have, like he was crossing a line that had been there all along but only now visible, and the distance between him and Naomi Carter widened, not physically by much, but symbolically in a way that everyone could feel, and Naomi did not move toward him, did not follow. She simply remained where she was, grounded, composed, her presence steady like a fixed point in a moment that had shifted around her, and the officers nearby adjusted with quiet efficiency, their posture aligning with the truth that had already surfaced, their attention now centered not on control but on correction, and the senior officer turned slightly toward Naomi, his tone respectful. "General, we will handle this." And again that word carried across the street, reinforcing what had already been revealed, making it impossible to ignore, impossible to reinterpret, and the crowd responded not with noise but with understanding, the kind that settles in when people realize they have witnessed something that cannot be undone. Phone still recording, but now capturing something different, not tension, but accountability, and Daniel stood just behind the line that had been drawn, his hands at his sides, his thoughts no longer racing but slowing, forcing him to see the moment clearly for the first time, not through assumption, not through habit, but through what had actually happened. And that clarity was uncomfortable, because it did not leave room for excuses, only reflection, and Naomi's gaze shifted briefly across the scene, not searching, not scanning, but observing, as if taking in the outcome without needing to claim it. And when she spoke, her voice carried the same calm authority that had defined her from the beginning. "Make sure it is understood," she said, "not directed at one person but at the moment itself. This is not about me." And the words landed with quiet impact, because they reached beyond the situation, beyond the street, into something larger, something that could not be reduced to a single interaction. And the senior officer nodded once, acknowledging not just her words but what they represented, and Daniel heard it, every part of it, because now there was nothing left to filter it through, no assumption to hide behind, only the truth standing clear in front of him. And for the first time since this began, he understood that this moment would not end when the street cleared. It would follow him long after, because some lessons do not arrive with noise. They arrive with silence that stays. The moment did not end with movement. It deepened with stillness. And as the officers around them settled into their positions, the weight of what had happened began to spread beyond the immediate circle, moving through the crowd, through the quiet street, through every person who had witnessed the shift from assumption to truth. and Naomi Carter stood unchanged at the center of it, not elevated by the reveal, not defined by the reaction, but anchored in something far more constant, a presence that had been there long before anyone noticed, and now impossible to overlook. And Officer Daniel Brooks remained a few steps back, no longer at the center of attention, but still inside the moment, still part of its consequence. His posture no longer rigid, with command, but held in a kind of quiet awareness, the kind that comes when the noise inside your head finally settles enough for you to hear what has been there all along. And around him the other officers moved with purpose, not rushed, not dramatic, but precise, their actions guided by procedure that now aligned with the reality in front of them. One of them speaking softly into a radio, another observing, documenting, ensuring that what had unfolded would be accounted for, not dismissed. And that detail mattered, because moments like this do not disappear on their own. They are either acknowledged or repeated, and Naomi's earlier words lingered in the air. "This is not about me," echoing quietly as if the street itself had absorbed them. And the senior officer nodded again, more firmly this time, turning slightly as if to make sure. Everyone understood the direction this was taking, not as punishment, not as spectacle, but as correction, and Daniel felt that distinction, felt how different it was from what he expected, because there was no raised voice, no public display, just a steady unfolding of accountability that did not need to announce itself to be real, and that made it harder to ignore, harder to deflect. And he exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him heavier than it should have, because it carried more than tension. It carried realization, and his eyes lifted once more, meeting Naomi's for a brief second, not in challenge, not in defense, but in something closer to understanding, because the moment had stripped everything else away, leaving only what mattered. And Naomi met that glance without hesitation, not holding it, not pressing it, just acknowledging it before letting it pass. Because this was never about proving anything to him, and the crowd, still gathered, still watching, had changed too. Their posture softer, their expressions more thoughtful, as if they had been pulled into something larger than a single event, something that asked them to reconsider what they saw, what they assumed, what they believed without question. And the phones that remained raised were no longer capturing a confrontation. They were capturing a lesson unfolding in real time. And as the scene continued to settle, the street itself seemed to breathe again, the tension easing, the edges softening, but the impact remained, woven into the memory of everyone present. And Naomi finally shifted her stance, not leaving, not turning away, but adjusting slightly as if preparing to move forward, because for her, this moment was not an end. It was simply one more instance in a long line of moments where truth had to stand still long enough to be seen. And as she took a single, measured step, the message was clear without being spoken. The moment had passed, but what it revealed would not fade with it. Naomi's step forward was quiet, almost unnoticeable, but it carried a finality that the entire street seemed to understand, because when someone like her moves, it is not to escape a moment. It is because the moment no longer has anything left to hold her, and the officers around her shifted just enough to create space, not as a command, not as a reaction, but as a natural response to presence. And the black SUV remained idling behind them, its engine a low, steady hum that now felt less like an interruption and more like a signal that something official had already taken its place. And the senior officer turned slightly, speaking into his radio with calm precision, his words too low for the crowd to catch, but clear enough in tone to indicate that this situation was no longer unfolding. It was being processed, documented, carried forward beyond this street, and that detail settled into the atmosphere like a quiet confirmation, because moments like this do not end where they begin. They move, they travel, they reach places the crowd cannot see, and Officer Daniel Brooks felt that realization take hold, not sharply, not all at once, but in layers, each second revealing more of what this meant beyond the immediate, beyond the watching eyes, beyond the phones that would replay this moment again and again. And he stood still, no longer trying to regain control, no longer searching for something to say, because there are moments when words only make the truth clearer, and he had reached that point. And Naomi did not look back at him again, not because she dismissed him, but because the moment between them had already completed itself. There was nothing left to resolve, nothing left to prove, And that was the part that lingered the most, because closure did not come with noise or confrontation. It came with understanding, and understanding does not always feel immediate. Sometimes it arrives slowly, long after the moment has passed, and the crowd began to shift, not dispersing all at once, but easing out of their positions, their voices returning in softer tones. Conversation starting again, but different now, less certain, more reflective, because they had seen something that did not fit the usual pattern, something that challenged what they thought they understood about power and presence. And the phones lowered one by one, not because there was nothing left to record, but because what mattered had already been captured, not just on screens, but in memory. And the officers continued their quiet coordination, one speaking with another, a brief exchange of nods, a shared understanding that the situation had moved into a different phase, and Daniel noticed it, how smoothly it happened, how naturally the structure corrected itself once the truth was clear, and that realization stayed with him, heavier than anything else, because it meant the moment had never needed to escalate. It had only needed to be seen correctly from the start. And Naomi reached the side of the SUV, pausing just for a second as the door was opened for her, not in ceremony, not in display, but in respect, and she placed her hand lightly on the frame, her posture unchanged, her expression steady. And before she stepped in, she looked once toward the horizon of the street, not at the people, not at the officers, but beyond them, as if acknowledging something larger than all of this. Something that extended past this single moment into a pattern she had lived through more times than anyone here could count. And then she entered the vehicle, the door closing with a soft, final sound that seemed to mark the end of what had just taken place, but not the end of what it meant, because as the SUV began to move, slowly pulling away from the curb, the silence it left behind carried more weight than any confrontation ever could. And for those still standing there, including Daniel, that silence would not fade quickly, because some moments do not end when they are over. They stay, they echo, they ask to be understood long after everything else has moved on. The SUV disappeared slowly down Maple Avenue, its dark frame blending into the rhythm of the street until it became just another vehicle in motion. But what it left behind did not move with it. It stayed, settled, into the pavement, into the air, into the people who remained standing there trying to process what they had just witnessed. And Officer Daniel Brooks felt that stillness more than anyone, because while everything around him began to return to normal, nothing inside him did. And that contrast was impossible to ignore. The way the world could continue as if nothing had changed while something fundamental had shifted within him. And the officers nearby resumed their routines with quiet professionalism, a few words exchanged, a few notes taken, the scene transitioning from moment to record, from experience to report. And that transition carried its own weight, because once something is documented, it no longer belongs to memory alone. It becomes part of something larger, something that can be reviewed, questioned, understood in ways that a single moment cannot contain. And Daniel stood at the edge of that process, no longer central, no longer in control, but still deeply connected to it. His thoughts replaying the sequence again and again, not searching for justification, but searching for understanding, because now there was no urgency, no pressure to act, only the quiet demand to reflect. And that demand felt heavier than any command he had given earlier, because it came from within, and it did not fade with time. And the crowd had mostly dispersed now, their presence replaced by the ordinary flow of the street, cars passing, footsteps echoing lightly against the sidewalk, conversations resuming in fragments. But even as they moved on, something lingered in the way people glanced back, in the way their expressions carried a hint of something unresolved, as if they knew they had witnessed more than a single interaction, something that asked a question without speaking it aloud. And Daniel noticed that too. The subtle shift in how he was seen, not with accusation, not with open judgment, but with awareness. And awareness can be more powerful than anything said out loud, because it does not need to declare itself to be felt. And he exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just slightly as the weight of the moment settled into something quieter, something more permanent. And one of the officers approached him, not confrontational, not aggressive, just present. "We will need a statement," the officer said, tone even, procedural, and Daniel nodded once. The motion simple but meaningful, because it marked a shift from reaction to accountability, from action to explanation. And as he turned slightly toward the patrol car, his steps felt different, not heavy, not forced, but deliberate, as if each one carried the understanding that this moment was not finished, it was only changing form. And behind him, Maple Avenue continued as it always had, calm, familiar, unchanged on the surface, but for those who had been there, for those who had seen what happened when truth stood still long enough to be recognized, it would never feel exactly the same again. Because some moments do not announce their importance while they are happening, they reveal it afterward, in the quiet, in the reflection, in the space where there is nothing left to do but understand. The patrol car door closed with a muted click, and the sound echoed longer than it should have in Daniel's mind, not because it was loud, but because everything around him had grown quiet enough for even the smallest detail to carry weight. And as he stood beside the vehicle, pen in hand, the paper in front of him no longer felt like routine. It felt like a mirror, reflecting back every second of what had just happened, every word, every assumption, every decision that had led him to this point. And the officer beside him waited without pressure, without urgency, simply present, allowing the silence to do its work. Because some statements are not written quickly, they are understood slowly, and Daniel stared at the blank lines for a moment, not searching for what to write, but realizing that what he wrote would not change what had already been seen. And that realization shifted something deeper than the situation itself, because for the first time, the focus was not on control, it was on truth, and truth does not bend to protect anyone. It simply waits to be acknowledged. And Daniel began to write, his hand steady but deliberate, each word placed with care, not to defend, not to justify, but to describe, because description was all that remained when assumption had been stripped away. And as he moved through the details, the memory unfolded differently than it had in the moment, clearer now, slower, revealing the parts he had overlooked, the calm in her voice, the steadiness in her posture, the absence of fear that he had mistaken for defiance. And each of those details carried meaning he had not recognized before, meaning that now could not be ignored. And the officer beside him glanced briefly at the page, then back at Daniel, not interrupting, not guiding, just observing, because this was not about correction, it was about accountability, and accountability does not need to be forced when it is understood. And as Daniel finished the statement, he paused for a second before handing it over, his fingers releasing the paper with a quiet finality, as if letting go of something more than just ink on a page. And the officer accepted it with a nod, not approving, not judging, simply acknowledging that the process had begun. And Daniel stepped back slightly, his eyes lifting toward the street, which had fully returned to its normal rhythm now, cars passing, people walking, the earlier tension replaced by the ordinary flow of a day continuing. And yet for him, nothing felt ordinary, because the moment had left a mark that would not fade with the movement of time. And he understood that now, not as a consequence imposed from the outside, but as something internal, something that would follow him into every future decision, every future interaction. Because once you see something clearly, you cannot unsee it. And that clarity settled into him, not heavy, not overwhelming, but present, steady, like a quiet voice that would not be ignored again. And as he stood there, no longer at the center of anything, just another figure on a familiar street, the realization formed fully for the first time. This was never about a single moment. It was about how moments are seen, how people are understood, and how easily both can be mistaken when judgment arrives before truth. And the street moved on, but Daniel remained still for just a second. Longer, because for him, the moment had not ended. It had only just begun to make sense. The day continued as if nothing had happened. But inside the station, time seemed to move differently, slower, heavier, like every second carried something unresolved. And Officer Daniel Brooks sat at a small desk under the steady hum of fluorescent lights, the same lights he had worked under for years, the same walls, the same routine. And yet everything felt unfamiliar, not because the place had changed, but because he had, and that difference was impossible to ignore. And across from him sat a senior supervisor, calm, composed, flipping through the report with careful attention, not rushing, not reacting, just reading, because moments like this are not handled with noise, they are handled with clarity. And Daniel watched the pages turn, each one holding a version of the moment that no longer belonged to him alone. And that realization settled deeper than anything else, because once something is written, once it is seen by others, it becomes part of a larger truth, something that cannot be reshaped to fit a single perspective. And the supervisor finally looked up, his expression neutral, not harsh, not forgiving, just steady. "Walk me through it," he said, and the request was simple, but it carried weight, because this was not about repeating what was already on paper. It was about understanding what had led to it. And Daniel took a breath, slow, measured, his voice quieter than it had been on the street, not uncertain, but deliberate, because now every word mattered in a different way. And as he spoke, the moment unfolded again, but this time without urgency, without pressure, just clarity. And he found himself noticing things he had not noticed before: the calm in her voice, the absence of resistance, the way she stood without needing to prove anything. And those details changed the story, not by adding to it, but by revealing what had always been there. And the supervisor listened without interruption, his posture unchanged, his focus steady, because listening is not passive when it is done with intent. And when Daniel finished, the room held a brief silence, not uncomfortable, but reflective, and the supervisor placed the report down gently, his voice even when he spoke again. "What you saw in that moment," he said, "and what was actually there, were not the same thing." And the words did not accuse, they clarified, and Daniel nodded slowly, because he understood that now, not as a statement directed at him, but as a truth that extended beyond him. And the supervisor continued, "That gap matters," he added, "because that is where decisions are made." And that sentence stayed, heavier than anything else, because it pointed to something deeper than a single mistake, something that could repeat if not recognized. And Daniel sat with that for a moment, letting it settle, because understanding does not come all at once. It builds, piece by piece. And as he sat there, the noise of the station carried on around them, phones ringing, footsteps moving, conversations blending into the background. But inside that small space, the moment remained still, held in place by the need to fully see it. And Daniel realized something then, something that had not been clear before. That authority is not just about what you can do, it is about how you see, and how you see determines everything that follows. And as that thought settled in, the supervisor nodded once, not signaling the end, but acknowledging that the conversation had reached the place it needed to. Because sometimes the most important part of a moment is not what happens during it, but what is understood after it. And as Daniel stood to leave, the weight he carried was not the same as before. It was not confusion, it was not tension, it was awareness. And awareness, once gained, does not fade. It stays, it shapes, it changes what comes next. The hallway outside the office felt longer than it had before, not because the distance had changed, but because Daniel Brooks was walking through it with a different awareness, each step quieter, more deliberate, as if the building itself had become a space for reflection rather than routine. And the familiar sounds of the station followed him, phones ringing, officers exchanging brief conversations, the steady rhythm of a place that never really stops. And yet for him, everything felt slowed down, filtered through what had just been understood. And as he reached the end of the corridor, he paused for a brief second near the glass doors that led outside, his reflection staring back at him. Uniform neat, posture intact, nothing visibly different, and yet everything beneath that surface had shifted, and that contrast stayed with him, because it revealed something important. That change does not always show itself immediately. Sometimes it exists quietly, shaping what comes next without announcing itself. And he stepped outside into the late afternoon air, the sky now softer, the light stretching across the parking lot in long golden lines. And for a moment he just stood there, taking it in, not to escape the weight of the day, but to understand it, to let it settle in a way that could not be rushed. And across the lot a patrol car pulled in, another officer stepping out, exchanging a quick nod with him. Nothing unusual, nothing different, and yet Daniel noticed it, the interaction, the assumption, the ease with which people move through moments without questioning what they see. And that was where everything began, not in the action itself, but in the way it was perceived. And he exhaled slowly, the breath steady, grounding, because now that understanding had become part of him, not as a lesson to remember, but as a lens he could not remove. and his phone buzzed lightly in his pocket, a message from dispatch, routine, procedural, asking for availability on the next call, and he looked at it for a second longer than usual, not because he did not know what to do, but because now he understood that. Every call carried more than just information. It carried context. It carried people. It carried truth that might not be visible at first glance. And that realization changed the weight of something as simple as a notification, and he typed a brief response, confirming his status, his fingers steady, his mind clear, not clouded by the earlier tension, but sharpened by what had come after. And as he slipped the phone back into his pocket, he looked out toward the street beyond the station. Traffic moving, people walking, life continuing as it always does, and yet he knew that for him, it would not feel exactly the same. Because once you understand the gap between what you assume and what is real, you cannot return to seeing things the same way again. And that understanding did not come with a dramatic shift. It came quietly, settling into the way he stood, the way he thought, the way he would move forward from this point on. And as he took a step toward his patrol car, the weight he carried was no longer confusion or tension. It was responsibility, not imposed, not forced, but accepted. Because some moments do not end when they are over, they continue in the choices that follow. And this was one of those moments. The engine of the patrol car started with a low, steady hum, and Daniel Brooks sat behind the wheel for a moment longer than necessary, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, not moving yet, because movement meant returning to routine, and routine no longer felt the same. And outside the windshield the world continued in its quiet, familiar rhythm. Cars passing, people crossing streets, the ordinary flow of a day that did not pause for anyone. And yet inside that car, something had shifted in a way that would not be undone. And Daniel looked ahead, not searching for anything, just observing, letting the stillness settle into something clear, something lasting. And he thought back to the moment on Maple Avenue, not with tension, not with resistance, but with a kind of clarity that only comes after everything else fades. And what stayed was not the sound of his own voice, not the presence of the crowd, not even the arrival of authority. What stayed was her stillness, the way Naomi Carter had stood without needing to prove anything, without raising her voice, without stepping back. And that stillness had carried more power than anything he had brought into that moment. And that realization remained steady, undeniable, because it revealed something deeper than the situation itself. Something about how easily power can be misunderstood when it is measured only by what is visible. And Daniel exhaled slowly, his grip on the wheel tightening, just slightly before relaxing again. And he understood now that what had happened was not just a mistake in judgment. It was a reflection of something larger, something that could not be corrected in a single moment, but could be changed in every moment that followed. And that was where responsibility truly began, not in the past, but in what came next. And he shifted the car into drive, the motion smooth, controlled, and as the vehicle began to move forward, it felt different, not because the road had changed, but because he had, and each passing block, each intersection, each glance at the world outside carried a new awareness, a quieter, more deliberate way of seeing. And somewhere in that awareness was the understanding that authority is not proven by force. It is defined by perception, by restraint, by the ability to see clearly before acting. And that understanding settled into him like something permanent, not heavy, not overwhelming, but present in a way that would not fade. And as he drove, the city stretched out ahead, familiar but no longer automatic, every moment, holding the possibility of being seen correctly or incorrectly. And that choice, he realized, would always be his, and far from that street, far from the crowd, far from the moment that had changed everything. Naomi Carter continued on her own path, unaffected by the need for recognition, because she had never needed it to begin with. And that contrast remained the clearest truth of all. That real authority does not demand to be seen. It simply exists, waiting for others to recognize it. And Daniel drove on, not trying to leave the moment behind, but carrying it with him in a way that would shape everything ahead. Because some lessons do not come with noise or consequence. They come with clarity, and clarity, once seen, does not let you return to who you were before. And as the road stretched forward, one thought remained, quiet but unshakable. He thought he understood power, but that day, Power showed him what it really looked like.